They say some monsters hide under the bed. But what if the real monster tucks you in at night, kisses your mother on the cheek, and pours you a glass of warm milk before locking you in the dark? This isn't a story about ghosts or shadows. It's about a little girl trapped in a house that smiled at the world, but whispered cruelty behind closed doors. It's about a golden retriever locked away like a secret too dangerous to be heard. And it's about how, sometimes, the warmest light comes from the coldest, darkest place imaginable. As a writer, this story shook me. It made me angry, heartbroken, and then quietly hopeful. What would you have done if you were Sarah or Grace? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you think. And don't stop halfway watch till the very end, because I've got a little gift waiting for you there. Now, let's go back and see how this all unfolded. The Beaumont mansion shimmered under the crisp autumn sun, a monument of old money and new secrets. Inside, the daily tableau of domestic bliss was meticulously arranged. Grace, a wisp of a girl around 7 or 8, her small frame seeming almost too delicate for the world, sat in her custom-designed wheelchair in the sun-drenched grand salon. Her large, expressive eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a perpetual shadow of sorrow, even when a polite smile touched her lips. Her legs, thin and unresponsive, were a constant, silent testament to the accident that had stolen her mobility. Her mother, Sarah, a woman whose gentle nature and unwavering love for her daughter were as apparent as her almost childlike trust in her husband, was reading aloud from a brightly illustrated storybook. Her voice, soft and melodic, wove tales of brave knights and enchanted forests, a stark contrast to the unspoken tensions that hummed beneath the polished veneer of their lives. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Victor Beaumont strode in, a titan of industry, with a smile as expensively tailored as his suits. In one hand, he held an extravagant bouquet of Sarah's favorite lilies. In the other, a sleek, gift-wrapped box for Grace. "My darlings," Victor's voice boomed, filling the already cavernous room. He presented the flowers to Sarah with a flourish and a kiss that lingered just a moment too long for genuine affection. A performance for an unseen audience. Sarah's face lit up. "Oh, Victor, they're beautiful. You always know how to spoil us." He then turned to Grace, his smile softening, or so it seemed. "And for my little princess," he placed the gift in her lap, an advanced learning tablet, the latest model, promising to unlock her cognitive potential. It was the kind of gift Victor favored: expensive, impressive, and utterly impersonal. Grace touched the screen, her fingers tracing the cool glass, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Papa Victor," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "You see, Sarah, the best for our Grace," Victor announced, his arm circling Sarah's waist. "I've also confirmed the new specialist from the city. Top of his field. He'll be starting her intensified home therapy sessions next week. The cost is considerable, but nothing is too much for our girl's recovery." He punctuated this with a paternal pat on Grace's head, a touch that was meant to be reassuring but felt heavy, possessive. Sarah's eyes welled with tears of gratitude. "You're a saint, Victor, always thinking of us, always doing so much." Victor's smile widened, but as his gaze flickered towards Grace, who was now staring blankly at the tablet, a micro-expression, a fractional tightening around his eyes, a near imperceptible curl of his lip, betrayed a chilling impatience. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "My dear," he said to Sarah, his voice dripping with synthetic sweetness, "I only want what's best for our Grace. She deserves every opportunity, and I will move heaven and earth to see her walk again." Her well-being is paramount. And of course, he added, a subtle shift in his tone. It speaks volumes about the stability and care within our family to the outside world. The last phrase hung in the air, a quiet admission of his true priorities. To Grace, his voice, though attempting a gentle cadence, remained stiff, almost metallic. This new tablet has state-of-the-art learning modules. Princess, you must apply yourself. Use it diligently. We've invested a great deal in your future, and we expect to see results. No slacking. Understand? His eyes, when they met hers, were not warm. They were chips of ice, assessing, demanding a correct response. Grace flinched almost invisibly at his touch on her shoulder, a gesture that was supposedly to adjust her posture, but felt more like a correction, a reminder of his control. She offered a small, forced nod, her gaze dropping to her lap. The tablet felt cold, alien. She rarely showed enthusiasm for Victor's gifts. Her thanks were always dutiful, mechanical. Sarah, ever the optimist, would later interpret Grace's reticence as a sign of her delicate constitution, or fatigue from her condition. It only made her admire Victor's unwavering patience and selfless dedication. All the more, the opportunities for Victor to be alone with Grace arose frequently. He was adept at manufacturing reasons for Sarah's absence. Darling, the Children's Foundation is having their annual gala upstate. You simply must represent us. It's for such a good cause. Or, an old college friend of yours is in town for just 2 days. Sarah, you should go. Catch up. Have some fun. You deserve a break. Sometimes, it was a business trip, one where Victor desperately needed Sarah's calming presence and emotional support. Though leaving Grace tugged at Sarah's heart, she acquiesced, eager to please Victor, and believing his reassurances that Grace would be perfectly fine with Mrs. Esther, their kind-hearted, aging housekeeper. The moment Sarah's car disappeared down the long, winding driveway, the transformation in Victor was instantaneous and terrifying. The charming smile dissolved as if it were a mask made of wax, melting away to reveal the cold, hard granite beneath. His eyes, moments before feigning warmth for Sarah, now glinted like sharpened steel as he turned towards Grace. He strode over to her wheelchair, his footsteps echoing ominously on the marble floor. Without a word, he gripped the handles, his knuckles white. "Time for your real therapy," he hissed, his voice a low, menacing growl. He pushed her, not gently, but with a rough, impatient force, out of the bright salon, through the dimming hallway, towards a narrow, unassuming door at the far end of the north wing. Behind it lay the steep, wooden steps leading down to the Beaumont family's sprawling, unfinished basement. The air grew noticeably colder with each foot they covered. The cheerful sounds of the house faded, replaced by the rhythmic, unnerving squeak and rattle of Grace's wheelchair wheels on the polished wood. Then the jarring bump as they reached the threshold of the basement stairs. Victor paused, his face illuminated by the single, bare bulb at the top of the stairs. "Down you go. This is what I call your specialized conditioning chamber. Consider it extreme endurance training." His lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "You want to walk so badly. Then you need to be strong. No room for weakness, for tears. Understand?" Grace's small hands flew to the armrests, her knuckles white as she gripped them. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted from Victor's impassive face to the shadowy abyss below. "No, Papa Victor. Please, fear," he sneered, his voice like a whip crack, "is a luxury for those who can afford to fail. Do you want to walk, or do you intend to be a burden, a leech, for the rest of your life?" He didn't wait for an answer. He expertly, yet brutally, maneuvered the wheelchair down the rickety steps, each thudding descent sending shivers of dread through Grace's tiny body. The basement was a cavern of cold stone and forgotten things. A single, weak, yellow bulb hung precariously from a frayed wire in the center of the vast space, its light sputtering, casting long, dancing, monstrous shadows on the damp, mottled walls. The air was thick, stagnant, and bitingly cold, saturated with the cloying, earthy scent of mildew, decaying paper, and a profound, almost tangible despair. Dust lay like a shroud over discarded furniture, forgotten trunks, and shapeless objects hidden beneath grimy tarpaulins. Cobwebs, thick as funeral veils, festooned every corner, every exposed pipe. Somewhere in the oppressive silence, a rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripped from a leaking pipe, a maddening metronome counting away the seconds of Grace's torment. A low moan of wind whistled through a boarded-up window slit, sounding like a mournful sigh. Victor wheeled Grace to the center of the largest, emptiest section of the basement, a bare concrete slab that felt like ice beneath the thin soles of her slippers. He bent down, his face uncomfortably close to hers. "You'll stay here until I decide you've had enough conditioning. Maybe a few hours of contemplating your shortcomings will motivate you to try harder with those expensive therapists." He straightened up, pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket, and strode back to the stairs. The basement door creaked shut with a groan of tortured wood, followed by the chilling, definitive thunk and scrape of the heavy bolt sliding into place. Then the distinct, metallic clack of the key turning in the lock. It was a sound of utter finality, an exclamation point on her isolation. Grace was alone, plunged into a chilling gloom, broken only by the feeble, jaundiced light bulb. The silence of the basement pressed in on her, suffocating. A raw, primal fear seized her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The shadows writhed and stretched, morphing into grotesque figures in her peripheral vision. Tears, hot and stinging, streamed down her pale cheeks, dripping onto the cold, unfeeling fabric of her dress. "Mama," she cried, her voice a choked sob, swallowed by the immense, indifferent space. "Mama, please, help me. Mama, where are you?" The echo mocked her, a cold, distorted whisper. "Papa Victor, it's so cold. I'm scared. I'm so scared of the dark." Her small body trembled violently, an uncontrollable ague of terror and cold. She felt utterly, terrifyingly abandoned, a tiny, broken doll discarded in a forgotten crypt. The damp chill of the basement floor seemed to crawl up her legs, into her very bones. A numbing, relentless cold that no amount of shivering could dispel. She hugged her useless legs, pulling her knees as close to her chest as she could, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the deepest shadows, expecting something horrible to emerge. When Sarah returned, often late in the evening, flushed from a social engagement, or tired from a day of travel, Victor would already have retrieved Grace. He'd ensure Grace was back in her room. Perhaps with a new bruise he'd explain away as a clumsy moment during her exercises, or looking particularly pale, which he'd attribute to overexertion in her noble efforts to recover. One evening, after a particularly harrowing session in the basement that had stretched for what felt like an eternity, Grace, still shivering despite the warm quilt Sarah tucked around her, her eyes swollen and red from hours of crying, clung to her mother's hand. "Mama, Mama," she stammered, her voice hoarse and weak, words tumbling out in a rush of residual terror. "Last night, when you were gone, Papa Victor, he took me downstairs to the basement. It was so dark. Mama, so cold. He locked me in. I was so scared. Victor, who had impeccable timing, appeared in the doorway, his expression a carefully constructed mask of sorrowful concern, tinged with a hint of weary disappointment. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, as if burdened by an immense weight. He approached the bed slowly, his voice soft, laden with feigned understanding and a subtle undercurrent of hurt. "Oh, Sarah, my love," he began, his gaze shifting from Sarah's worried face to Grace, an expression that artfully blended pity and paternal forbearance. "There she goes again, our imaginative little girl. Her spirit is so vivid." He sat on the edge of the bed, taking Sarah's other hand. "Sweetheart, I know Grace has been through so much. It's understandable she gets confused. I did take her downstairs. Yes, but it was to the new, climate-controlled therapy room we're having specially equipped in the renovated part of the basement. It's quiet there, fewer distractions. The specialists, the very best ones, you know, they all stress the importance of mental fortitude, of conquering small challenges independently. It's a crucial part of her recovery process. It helps build her resilience." He then looked at Grace, his eyes conveying a deep, counterfeit sadness. "Perhaps my methods are a bit unconventional, a touch strict, but it breaks my heart to see her struggle. Sarah, everything I do, every difficult decision I make, is for her future. We must be strong, my love, steadfast for Grace." Sarah, caught between her daughter's tearful, fragmented accusation and her husband's calm, rational, loving explanation, felt her resolve crumble. Victor sounded so reasonable, so caring. He was sacrificing so much, wasn't he? She looked at Grace's trembling form, then at Victor, his face etched with what she perceived as the pain of being misunderstood while trying to do his best. Her heart ached for Grace, but Victor's narrative was too compelling, too aligned with the image of the devoted stepfather she desperately wanted to believe in. A wave of guilt washed over her for even momentarily doubting him. She pulled Grace into a hug, stroking her hair. "Oh, my poor baby," she cooed. "You must be brave. Sweetie, try to be a strong girl for Mama and Papa Victor. You have to trust him. He loves you so much, and he only wants you to get better, to walk again. He's doing all of this for you." Grace went limp in her mother's embrace, a profound silence falling over her. The last embers of hope for rescue flickered and died. The basement, Victor's lies, her mother's blindness. It was a cage built of stone and deceit, and she was trapped within it. Despair, cold and absolute, settled deep within her heart. During her lonely, terrifying vigils in the basement, after the initial storm of tears had subsided, and an eerie, watchful silence descended, Grace began to notice other sounds, faint, almost imperceptible at first. They were distinct from the dripping water or the sighing wind. There was a soft, intermittent scratching, like tiny claws against wood, a low, mournful whimper, so quiet it could have been the settling of the old house, and sometimes a series of soft, snuffling sounds, as if something or someone was struggling to breathe, followed by a long, drawn-out, almost inaudible sigh. These sounds emanated from the very far end of the basement, from behind a heavy, reinforced wooden door secured with a large, rusty padlock. It was the darkest, most remote corner of the subterranean labyrinth. Initially, these unfamiliar noises amplified Grace's fear. her imagination conjuring even more terrifying specters in the gloom. But as the conditioning sessions continued, week after week, a sliver of desperate curiosity began to pierce through her terror. It was the sound of another living being, perhaps another prisoner in this cold, dark hell. She started to observe Victor more closely, her fear sharpening her senses. Occasionally, even when Sarah was home, Victor would make his way to the basement, muttering excuses about checking the boiler or fetching something from storage. His expression on these descents was always grim, a mixture of irritation and distaste. Sometimes, she'd see him carry a small, battered metal bowl, often containing what looked like cold, leftover scraps. Other times, more alarmingly, he'd carry a short, stout wooden stick. He would head directly to that padlocked room at the far end. Grace, straining her ears from her cold prison, would hear the jangle of keys, the protesting screech of the old lock being forced open. Then, usually, Victor's voice, a low, angry snarl, too indistinct to make out the words. But the tone was unmistakable. The faint whimpering from behind the door would abruptly cease, or perhaps morph into an even softer, more pathetic whine. After a few minutes, Victor would emerge, his face set in a hard line, and he would meticulously relock the door before ascending the stairs, leaving the basement once more to its chilling silence and its secrets. Grace didn't know what, or who, was confined in that hidden room. She only sensed a profound mystery, an undercurrent of sadness and dread that clung to it, a dread that mirrored her own. Unbeknownst to her, behind that door was Cooper, a golden retriever Victor had acquired some time ago. He had initially intended Cooper to be a family dog, another prop for his perfect life. But the dog's exuberance and natural affection had quickly become an annoyance, especially its intuitive warmth towards Grace, a warmth Victor seemed to resent. Cooper was now relegated to the basement, neglected and ill-treated, another secret hidden beneath the pristine facade of the Beaumont estate. Grace's clandestine therapy sessions continued unabated whenever Sarah was conveniently out of the house. Her physical health visibly declined. She grew paler, thinner, the shadows under her eyes deepening into dark bruises. Her spirit, however, though battered, clung to a fragile thread. She spoke less and less, retreating into an inner world, but her ears were always alert, straining for those faint, mysterious sounds from the locked room. Sarah, cocooned in the elaborate fiction Victor had woven, saw only her daughter's increasing frailty and quietness. Victor expertly explained it away as a natural, though difficult, phase of her intensive recovery. The body and mind are under tremendous strain, but it's a sign the therapy is challenging her, forcing her to adapt. His reassurances, delivered with just the right blend of concern and authority, kept Sarah's anxieties at bay, her faith in him unshaken. Victor, however, was growing increasingly impatient. Grace's lack of progress, her silent resistance, was a daily affront to his control. The look in his eyes when he regarded her grew colder, harder, a glint of something truly cruel beginning to surface more frequently. And in the long, cold winter nights, as Grace shivered in the damp chill of the basement, the soft whimpers and tentative scratches from the far end of the darkness became more than just sounds. They became a quiet acknowledgement of shared suffering, a perplexing, almost subliminal flicker of kinship in the overwhelming desolation. The faint, desperate sounds from the locked room at the end of the basement corridor had become Grace's grim companions during her terrifying conditioning sessions. They were a constant, sorrowful underscore to her own misery, a shared suffering she couldn't name but felt deep in her bones. Victor, however, saw only defiance in Grace's continued physical frailty and her silent, withdrawn demeanor, his patience, always a thin veneer over a core of cold ambition, was wearing dangerously thin. The endurance training in the frigid basement hadn't yielded the miraculous progress he demanded. Grace wasn't suddenly standing, wasn't showing the steely resolve he expected, so he decided to escalate his methods. One particularly bleak afternoon, with Sarah conveniently dispatched to a vital fundraising luncheon across town, Victor wheeled Grace down into the familiar gloom. But this time, there was a new, ominous addition to the scene, a large, galvanized steel bucket filled to the brim with water and chunks of ice that clinked malevolently as he set it down on the concrete floor. Grace eyed the bucket, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. Victor's face was a mask of detached, almost scientific interest. "Your current regimen isn't producing the desired effect," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We need to jolt your system, shock the dormant nerves into activity. It's called cryotherapy, a proven technique for stimulating unresponsive muscle groups." He picked up the bucket, the water sloshing precariously. "This will stimulate your entire body. Sometimes, a significant shock is precisely what's needed to awaken what's paralyzed. This is, as always, for your own good." Before Grace could utter a syllable, before she could even process the clinical horror of his words, he upended the bucket. A torrent of ice-cold water cascaded over her small, seated form. Grace's scream was a raw, piercing shriek of agony and shock, swallowed by the damp, uncaring walls. The sudden, brutal cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath, driving the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. Her body convulsed violently, an uncontrollable tremor seizing her from head to toe. Her skin, already pale, turned a ghastly shade of blue as goosebumps erupted across its surface. Her teeth chattered with such force she thought they might break. It felt as if 1,000 icy needles were being driven into every inch of her flesh, the cold seeping instantly into her bones, a marrow-deep ache that was unbearable. She struggled for air, her chest tight, a suffocating pressure building. Then, as the initial shockwave subsided, a profound numbness began to creep through her limbs, followed by an exhaustion so complete it was terrifying. This was a new dimension of fear, colder and more invasive than the darkness itself. The cold shock therapy became a regular feature of her basement sessions. Each dousing left Grace weaker, more susceptible to illness. She developed a persistent, rattling cough. Fevers became her constant companions, burning her up one moment, leaving her racked with chills the next. Nightmares plagued her sleep. She'd wake up screaming, thrashing in her sweat-soaked bed, calling out for her mother, sometimes babbling incoherently about ice and shadows and a terrible, crushing cold. She lost weight rapidly, her already delicate frame becoming almost skeletal. Her eyes, those stormy sea-blue orbs, sank deeper into their sockets, ringed with dark purple, reflecting a haunted, listless emptiness. Sarah could no longer ignore the drastic decline in her daughter's health. The vibrant little girl she remembered was fading, replaced by this pale, trembling ghost. Victor's glib explanations about transitional phases and the body adapting to intensive therapy now sounded hollow, almost cruel, in the face of Grace's obvious suffering. "Victor, look at her." Sarah finally confronted him one evening, her voice tight with a new, desperate anxiety. Grace had just woken from another screaming nightmare, her small body still trembling in Sarah's arms. "This isn't normal. She's burning with fever again. She's barely eating. This isn't working. Maybe we should get a second opinion. Perhaps from Dr. Albright? Or take her to the children's hospital. Victor, ever the master manipulator, feigned deep concern, his brow furrowing. He gently took Grace from Sarah, laying the child back against the pillows, his touch deceptively tender. "My dearest Sarah," he said, his voice a low, soothing balm. "I understand your fear. Truly, I do. Seeing her like this, it pains me more than you can imagine." He sighed, a sound of profound, put-upon weariness. But these reactions, as alarming as they seem, are actually documented in some of the more aggressive, cutting-edge restorative therapies. It's the body expelling toxins, a sign of deep cellular regeneration. It's a difficult, arduous phase, I grant you, but absolutely necessary if we hope to see any real improvement. We must trust the process. Trust the specialists I've consulted. The very best. Remember, he then produced a file from his briefcase. "Look here," he said, spreading out several glossy printouts on the bed. Articles adorned with impressive-looking medical insignia and complex jargon. These are peer-reviewed studies from European clinics specializing in advanced neurological recovery. They detail similar patient responses during intensive treatment. It's called a healing crisis. We must remain steadfast. Sarah scanned the documents, her eyes blurring over the dense text and unfamiliar terms. They looked official, authoritative. Victor pointed to highlighted sections, his explanations weaving a convincing narrative of hope through hardship. A sliver of reassurance penetrated her fear, but a tiny, persistent seed of doubt remained, a cold knot in her stomach that wouldn't quite dissolve. Victor had been so insistent on his chosen specialists, so dismissive of her suggestions for local doctors she knew and trusted. Grace, despite her profound terror and weakness, sometimes found the strength for feeble protests during Victor's treatments, as he'd prepare the ice water or roughly position her for some new, agonizing exercise. A small, broken whimper would escape her lips. "Papa Victor, please, no more water. I'm so cold," she'd plead, her voice barely audible, tears freezing on her lashes. "It hurts. Please." She would try to shrink away, to make herself smaller, an instinctive, futile attempt to avoid the inevitable. Victor, however, had noticed Grace's occasional, furtive glances towards the locked room at the far end of the basement, her head tilting as if listening to the faint sounds from within. He saw not nascent curiosity, but another potential weakness to exploit. One day, as Grace shivered uncontrollably after a dousing, her lips blue, Victor's eyes narrowed. He gestured sharply with his chin towards the padlocked door. "You hear that?" he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "That's Cooper, your mother's precious golden retriever. She adored that mutt." A cruel smile touched his lips. "He's in there, and he gets quite energetic when he's hungry, and I haven't been remembering to feed him much lately." He leaned closer, his breath cold on her cheek. "You see, Grace, if you don't start cooperating fully, if you don't show me some real progress with these exercises, if you continue to be a disappointment, well, I might just decide that Cooper needs a little company, a little playmate. I'll let him in here with you. We'll see how brave you are then, how well you endure that kind of therapy." He straightened, a look of grim satisfaction on his face as he watched the fresh wave of absolute horror wash over Grace's features. The threat struck Grace with the force of a physical blow, the abstract fear of the cold and dark. The pain of Victor's treatments was terrifying enough, but the image he conjured, a large, starving, ferocious dog, trapped and angry, unleashed upon her in this dungeon, was a nightmare beyond comprehension. She'd seen Cooper briefly, long ago, when he was a puppy, before Victor had banished him. He had seemed playful then, but Victor's words painted a monstrous picture. This new terror was a living, breathing thing, with teeth and claws, and it eclipsed everything else. Her small world, already shrinking, constricted further into a pinprick of pure, unadulterated dread. Sleep offered no escape, as her nightmares now featured not just ice and shadows, but the snarling maw of a phantom beast. The truth about Cooper was far more pathetic, yet no less cruel. Victor had initially purchased the pedigreed golden retriever puppy as another accoutrement to his carefully curated image of the benevolent family man. Sarah had been delighted, and for a short while, Cooper had brought a rare flicker of uncomplicated joy into the Beaumont mansion. He was a typical golden exuberant, loving, and utterly devoted. He'd been particularly drawn to Grace, sensing perhaps her vulnerability, and would often try to lay his head gently on her lap, his tail thumping a soft rhythm of comfort, especially when Sarah was nearby to supervise. This, however, was precisely what Victor couldn't tolerate. He saw the burgeoning affection between the child and the dog as a threat to his absolute control, a source of solace for Grace that wasn't him. This sentimental drivel, he'd muttered to himself one afternoon, watching from his study window as Cooper nudged a ball towards Grace's listless hand in the garden, Sarah smiling beside them. It's unhygienic. It'll distract from her therapy. It will undermine the discipline I'm trying to instill. They need to be separated. Immediately. Soon after, Cooper vanished from the main house and grounds. Victor announced the dog had developed an unfortunate aggression and had been sent to a special training facility upstate. In reality, Cooper was unceremoniously dragged to the basement and locked in the far storeroom. He was fed sporadically, just enough to keep him alive, often nothing more than stale bread crusts or the unappetizing remnants of Victor's own meals. The room was dark, damp, and cold. His once glossy coat became matted and dull. His once bright eyes filled with a perpetual sadness. The barks, the whines, the desperate scratching at the door that Grace heard were not signs of ferocity, but the heartbreaking cries of a lonely, confused, and slowly starving animal, longing for freedom, for kindness, for the gentle touch of a human hand. For Victor, Cooper was no longer a pet, but a tool, a convenient instrument of fear, a disposable asset to be used as he saw fit. With each passing week, Grace spiraled further into a state of chronic illness and acute terror. The cold shock therapy continued, each session a fresh trauma, and the threat of Cooper hung over her like a perpetually poised guillotine. She lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, her small body perpetually braced for the next onslaught of pain or fear. Sarah, though still partially swayed by Victor's elaborate deceptions and faked medical documents, found her unease solidifying into a gnawing anxiety. Grace's decline was too steep, too persistent. She started observing Victor more closely, noticing the subtle flicker of irritation in his eyes when Grace cried, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when Sarah questioned his methods. The cracks in her carefully constructed trust were beginning to widen, though she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge the abyss they might reveal. Down in his cold, dark prison, Cooper was also fading. The lack of food, water, and any form of affection was taking its toll. Yet, deep within him, the spark of his golden retriever spirit, the instinct to connect, to love, to protect, still flickered, however faintly. He could hear Grace's cries sometimes, a thin, reedy sound that resonated with his own misery. Victor, observing Grace's continued failure to thrive, and her stubborn refusal to improve, felt his frustration mount. His carefully laid plans were being thwarted by the sheer resilience of a broken child. His face would often settle into a mask of cold fury as he watched her. New, more sinister thoughts began to coalesce in his mind. Plots in which Cooper would play a far more active and far more terrifying role than just a disembodied threat. The game, he decided, needed to change. Victor Beaumont was a man unaccustomed to failure, and Grace's persistent lack of improvement was a galling affront to his authority, a flaw in the otherwise perfect tapestry of his controlled existence. The cold shock therapy, the basement confinements, none of it had broken her. In his warped perception, she wasn't a victim of his cruelty, but a stubborn, willful child, deliberately defying him. Her spirit inexplicably resilient. He imagined her frail body housed a core of obstinate laziness, a refusal to exert the willpower he deemed necessary for recovery. The societal pressure to maintain the facade of the devoted husband and doting stepfather, a role he played with theatrical precision for Sarah and their limited social circle, also gnawed at him. Grace's condition, her immobility, was a constant, inconvenient reminder of an unresolved problem, an imperfection in his carefully curated life. He was done with incremental treatments. He needed a definitive, final solution. His gaze, increasingly cold and calculating, fell upon the idea of Cooper. The dog, already established in Grace's mind as a starved, ferocious beast, would be his ultimate instrument of terror. Victor held a perverse, almost fanatical belief that an overwhelming, primal fear could shock Grace into submission, or perhaps even trigger some dormant, miraculous ability to save herself, to stand, to walk, to flee. It was a desperate, cruel gamble, born of frustration and a chilling lack of empathy. Cooper, the neglected animal in the basement, was to be his ace in the hole. With a cold, methodical cruelty, Victor began his preparations. For 2 full days, he withheld all food and water from Cooper. The heavy padlock on the far basement room remained untouched. He wanted the golden retriever not just hungry, but desperate, maddened by thirst and starvation. Believing this would transform the naturally gentle breed into the vicious monster he had described to Grace. Down in the main section of the basement where Grace was usually confined for her sessions, she could hear the agonizing progression of Cooper's suffering. The initial barks, strong and indignant, demanding release and sustenance, echoed through the cold stone. Then, as the hours wore on, they became weaker, laced with a desperate, mournful quality. By the second day, the barking had ceased, replaced by heart-wrenching whimpers, pathetic, sorrowful moans, and the faint, almost exhausted scratching of paws against the unyielding wood of his prison door. Grace, shivering in her own isolation during one of Victor's check-ins, listened to these sounds, a terrible conflict raging within her small chest. Victor's threats had painted Cooper as a monster, a creature to be feared above all else. Yet, the raw anguish in those fading cries resonated with her own suffering. A profound, childlike empathy stirred within her, a sorrow for the unseen creature enduring a torment so similar to her own. The fear of Cooper didn't vanish, but it was now intertwined with a poignant pity and a growing, nameless dread about what horrors Victor was orchestrating. On the 3rd day, Victor deemed Cooper sufficiently primed. His eyes held a feverish glint of anticipation as he descended into the basement. He unlocked Cooper's cell. The dog, once a magnificent golden creature, was now a gaunt, skeletal wreck. His beautiful coat was dull and matted, his ribs starkly visible. He barely had the strength to lift his head from the damp floor. When Victor roughly grabbed his collar, Cooper managed only a low, rumbling growl, a mere whisper of his former vitality, too weak to offer any real resistance. Victor dragged the stumbling, emaciated dog towards the small, empty utility room he had designated for this final, brutal act. A claustrophobic space with bare concrete walls and a single, dim bulb. Grace was already there, left on a thin mat on the floor, her wheelchair just outside the door. She had been subjected to another dousing of ice water earlier, and was now trembling uncontrollably, her lips blue. She heard the scuffling outside, then the key turning in the lock of her small prison. The door creaked open, and her eyes widened in absolute terror as she saw Victor, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, hauling the limp, unsteady form of the golden retriever into the room with her. It was him, the dog, the monster from her nightmares. Victor gave Cooper a vicious shove, sending the weak animal sprawling onto the concrete floor a few feet from Grace. Then, with a speed that belied his bulk, he slammed the door shut, the heavy bolt thudding home with terrifying finality. Through the closed door, Grace heard Victor's voice, laced with a triumphant, sadistic chuckle. "This is your final lesson, Grace. Let's see if abject terror can finally unlock that stubborn body of yours. Let's see you walk now. Pray, little girl, pray that he's not as hungry as I've made him." Grace didn't scream. She couldn't. The sound was frozen in her throat, a block of pure ice. Her eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking from beneath the lids, tracing icy paths down her already frigid cheeks. She curled herself into the tightest possible ball in the corner, her small hands covering her head, every muscle in her tiny body rigid with a terror so profound it was almost paralytic. Her mind reeled, conjuring horrific images of teeth and claws, of pain and oblivion. This was it. This was how it ended. Inside the chillingly dim room, Cooper lay where he had fallen for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up on trembling legs. He staggered, his body swaying with weakness. His head hung low, his once proud, plumed tail now tucked tightly against his emaciated flanks. He looked around the small, cold space, his sunken eyes, surprisingly, still holding a flicker of their inherent intelligence. They fell upon the small, trembling ball of humanity cowering in the corner. He took a hesitant step, then another. There was no growl, no snarl, no hint of the savage aggression Victor had so meticulously tried to cultivate and so confidently expected. Instead, a soft, almost confused whimper escaped his dry throat. He sniffed the air, his nostrils twitching, as if trying to place a scent, a memory. Grace, feeling the slight shift in the air, the almost imperceptible sound of movement, tensed further, bracing for the inevitable attack. She could hear his labored breathing drawing closer. Cooper moved with an agonizing slowness, each step an effort. He reached her corner. Grace held her breath, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Then, something wholly unexpected happened. A soft, warm puff of air touched her icy hand. Cooper let out another low, plaintive whine, a sound not of aggression, but of profound sadness. And then, very gently, almost tentatively, a warm, slightly rough tongue delicately licked her clenched, frozen fingers. The touch was so startlingly gentle, so contrary to every terrifying expectation, that Grace's eyes flew open. She stared, disbelieving, into a pair of deep, soulful amber eyes, filled not with menace, but with an overwhelming, heart-wrenching sorrow and a soft, questioning light. The great, gaunt head nudged her arm, a soft, insistent pressure. Cooper then let out a long, shuddering sigh and, with infinite care, lowered his frail body to the cold concrete beside her. He pressed himself against her trembling form, his surprisingly soft, though matted, fur a sudden, unexpected barrier against the biting chill of the room. He curled his body around hers, a golden crescent of unexpected warmth. Grace remained frozen for a moment, utterly stunned. The monster was warm. The monster was gentle. The monster was sad. Tears began to stream down her face, no longer just tears of terror, but tears of shock, of confusion, of a dawning, incomprehensible relief. A tiny, fragile warmth, originating from the surprising contact with the dog's fur, began to seep through the layers of her icy clothes, reaching the frozen landscape of her heart. It was the first genuine warmth she had felt in what seemed like an eternity. Slowly, timidly, her hand, still trembling, reached out. Her fingers brushed against Cooper's fur. It was surprisingly soft beneath the grime and matting. The dog responded with a faint, contented sigh, nudging his head a little closer. A broken whisper escaped Grace's lips, a question directed more at the universe than at the creature beside her. "Cooper," she breathed, her voice raspy, disbelieving. Is that really you?" Outside the door, Victor listened, his ear pressed against the cold wood. He had drilled a tiny peephole earlier, a pinprick in the thick paneling, wanting to witness his ultimate triumph, to see Grace's spirit finally shatter. He waited for the screams, for the snarls of a desperate, starving animal, for the sounds of his cruel plan coming to fruition. Silence, or not quite silence. He could hear a soft whimpering, but it wasn't Grace. And then, nothing that sounded like an attack. His curiosity overriding his patience, he peered through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold, then boil with an incandescent rage. The dog, his starved instrument of terror, was not tearing the girl apart. It was curled around her, its head resting near her lap. And Grace had a hand resting on the dog's back, her expression one of stunned, tearful bewilderment, not shrieking terror. Victor stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. His meticulously crafted scenario of horror had dissolved into this travesty of gentleness and inexplicable connection. The initial shock gave way to a furious, sputtering rage. The stupid, useless animal. It had failed him, and the girl, the insolent, defiant child, had somehow, yet again, thwarted him. "Imbecile dog," he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice a low, venomous snarl, unheard by those inside. "Worthless cur, and you," his furious gaze through the peephole fixed on Grace, "you wretched, obstinate little—" He couldn't even form the words, so consumed was he by his impotent fury. He slammed his fist against the basement wall beside the door, the dull thud echoing his profound frustration. His perfect, cruel plan lay in ruins, mocked by the gentle warmth of a starving dog and the quiet tears of a broken child. Inside the small, cold room, Grace wasn't aware of Victor's fury. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the crushing weight of her fear had eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of wonder. She was still cold, still weak, but she wasn't alone. The steady, rhythmic breathing of the large, warm body pressed against hers was a profoundly comforting sound. The unexpected, unearned kindness of this creature, whom she had been taught to fear above all else, was a balm to her wounded spirit. Victor, fuming outside the locked door, felt his control slipping. This setback was intolerable. His rage, denied its expected outlet, began to curdle into something even darker, more unpredictable. If fear wouldn't break her, if even a starved animal wouldn't obey his will, then he would have to devise something else, something even more final. Sarah, upstairs in the sunlit rooms of the Beaumont mansion, went about her day, oblivious to the life-and-death drama unfolding in the cold, dark underbelly of her home. Her trust in her perfect husband, though perhaps infinitesimally frayed around the edges by Grace's worsening condition, remained largely intact, a testament to Victor's insidious powers of manipulation. But in that small, forgotten room, a sacred, unspoken bond had been forged in the crucible of shared suffering. A little girl and a starving dog, thrown together by an act of profound cruelty, had found an unexpected solace in each other's presence. A tiny spark of hope had been kindled in the oppressive darkness, fragile and vulnerable, yet fiercely, miraculously alive. The danger from Victor, however, was far from over. In fact, it had just become infinitely more perilous. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The fragile truce forged in shared suffering between Grace and Cooper, a sliver of warmth in the icy dungeon of Victor's making, was an affront Victor Beaumont could not abide. His meticulously constructed world of control had been challenged by a starved dog's gentleness and a broken child's resilience. His fury, denied its sadistic satisfaction, simmered into a far more dangerous, unpredictable rage across the quiet, manicured street. In a modest clapboard house that stood as a silent observer to the Beaumonts' opulent fortress, lived Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, a retired elementary school teacher in her late 70s. Widowed and childless, Mrs. Peterson possessed a keen eye for the subtle currents of her neighborhood and a heart that had never quite lost its protective, teacherly instincts. Her days were quiet, filled with gardening, reading, and the gentle rhythm of a life lived with observation. She had, on several occasions, noted young Grace Beaumont during those rare, orchestrated appearances in the expansive gardens. Even from a distance, the child's pallor, the unnatural fragility of her small frame, and the haunted look in her wide eyes had pricked at Mrs. Peterson's concern. Sarah Beaumont, too, often seemed to carry a weight of unspoken sorrow. Her smiles strained, her interactions with her husband tinged with a subtle deference that felt more like fear than affection. And Victor Beaumont himself, he was a figure of smooth, cold control, his public displays of affection for his wife and stepdaughter always feeling a shade too rehearsed. His eyes like chips of ice. More disturbingly, on evenings when she knew Sarah Beaumont was away, her car absent from the sweeping circular driveway, Mrs. Peterson had sometimes heard things, faint, quickly stifled sounds that might have been cries, carried on the night air, an occasional, sharp crack, like something heavy being thrown or dropped. And then there were the dog's barks, not the happy yelps of a contented pet, but strange, unsettling vocalizations. Sometimes they were long, mournful howls that tugged at her heart. Other times, they were sharp, angry, desperate barks that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the house, perhaps the basement. These discordant notes in the symphony of their affluent, outwardly serene neighborhood had woven a tapestry of unease in Mrs. Peterson's mind, a growing, nagging suspicion that something was terribly wrong within the Beaumont walls. Tonight, that unease would crystallize into horrified certainty. Victor, his face a mask of contorted fury, descended into the basement once more. The betrayal of Cooper, the dog's inexplicable gentleness towards Grace, had pushed him over the edge, His authority had been flouted, his power mocked. He was beyond reasoning, beyond any semblance of his carefully constructed public persona. He would reassert his dominance, punish their defiance, and this time there would be no mistakes. In his hand, he gripped a heavy, knotted length of rope, and in his eyes burned a terrifying, almost gleeful malice. He wrenched open the door to the small utility room where Grace and Cooper huddled together. The sudden influx of harsh light from the main basement area made them both flinch. Cooper, though still gaunt and weak, scrambled to his feet, a low growl already rumbling in his chest. Victor's eyes, blazing with a terrifying light, fixed on Grace. "You thought you were clever, didn't you?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Both of you. Thought you could defy me." He took a menacing step into the room. Seeing the rope, seeing the unhinged fury in Victor's face, a primal terror unlike anything she had ever experienced ripped through Grace. This was it. This was worse than the ice, worse than the darkness. This was annihilation. A scream, raw, piercing, and utterly desperate, tore from her throat, echoing up from the depths of the house. "No, don't. Somebody help me. Mommy, please. Somebody save me." The sound of Grace's unbridled terror acted as a lightning rod for Cooper. All his remaining strength, all his innate loyalty and protective instinct, surged through his emaciated frame. With a speed that belied his weakened state, he launched himself forward, placing his body squarely between Victor and the cowering child. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a terrifying snarl. A deep, guttural growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated protective rage, erupted from his chest. He stood his ground, legs splayed, head lowered, every fiber of his being's radiating defiance. "Get out of the way, you useless mutt!" Victor roared, brandishing the rope. Cooper responded with a volley of furious, deafening barks, sharp, challenging, and utterly fearless. He was no longer the starving, whimpering creature. He was a guardian, a sentinel, prepared to defend his charge to the death. As Victor lunged towards Grace, Cooper lunged too, snapping at the man's advancing legs, a desperate attempt to drive him back. The cacophony was horrifying. Grace's continuous, heart-rending screams, Cooper's ferocious barks and savage growls, Victor's enraged bellows, and the sickening thud of the rope as he tried to strike the dog. It all blended into a maelstrom of terror that spilled out of the basement, seeping through the boarded-up window slits, creeping up the stairs, and finally, escaping the confines of the Beaumont mansion into the stillness of the night. The earlier storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, quiet world that amplified every chilling sound. Mrs. Peterson was in her kitchen, preparing a late-night cup of chamomile tea, her old bones unsettled by the earlier atmospheric turbulence. A window was cracked open to let in the cool, post-storm air. Suddenly, the sounds hit her. First, a child's scream so piercing, so filled with sheer terror, that the cup rattled in her hand. Then, the unmistakable, savage barking of a dog, not just angry, but desperate, fighting, and beneath it all, a man's enraged shouting. Her blood ran cold. This was no ordinary domestic disturbance. This was something monstrous. All her accumulated fears, her vague suspicions, coalesced into a single, horrifying certainty. That child was in mortal danger. Without a second thought, her hand, trembling but resolute, reached for the telephone on the wall. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she dialed 911, Police Department. A calm voice answered. "Hello, Police Department. This is Eleanor Peterson," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, each word clear and urgent. I live at 12 Willow Creek Lane, directly across from the Beaumont residence at number 15. I believe there's severe child abuse and animal abuse happening right now at the Beaumont house. I can hear a child screaming, terrible screams, and a dog barking very, very aggressively, like it's fighting. Please, you have to send someone immediately. I think they're in the basement. While Victor was momentarily grappling with Cooper, who, despite a blow from the rope that had sent him yelping, was relentlessly trying to get between Victor and Grace, the dog's sharp senses picked up something else. A flicker of movement, a change in the air near a boarded-up basement window, days of desperate confinement, of scratching and gnawing at any perceived weakness in his prison, had loosened one of the old wooden planks. With a surge of adrenaline born of Grace's terror, Cooper threw his battered body against the boards. One splintered, then gave way with a crack. He squeezed through the narrow opening, his fur catching on the jagged wood, and tumbled out into the damp soil of the overgrown flower bed just outside the basement wall. But Cooper didn't run. He didn't flee to safety. His first instinct was Grace. He scrambled to his paws. Ориентируясь не на побег, а на спасение, orienting himself not on escape, but on rescue. He raced around the side of the sprawling mansion, his barks now sharp and incessant, a clear alarm. He reached the front driveway just as the distant wail of sirens grew louder. He saw the approaching flashing blue and red lights. Without hesitation, the golden retriever, a true hero in a matted, bleeding coat, began to bark even more frantically, running back and forth at the edge of the driveway, a clear beacon in the night. As the first police cruiser screeched to a halt, Cooper turned and bolted back towards the side of the house, towards a half-hidden external cellar door that led directly to the basement, barking non-stop, urging them to follow. Unit 2 on scene at 15 Willow Creek. Officer Miller reported into his radio. His partner, Officer Ramirez, already out of the car. Got a dog here. Looks like he's trying to show us something. The sounds from the basement were now terrifyingly clear. The child's screams had subsided into choked, intermittent sobs, but Victor's enraged roars and the thudding sounds continued. Following Cooper's desperate lead, the officers raced to the cellar door. It was old, wooden, and secured with a heavy, rusted bolt. "Police, open up," Ramirez yelled, pounding on the door. Only a furious bellow from within answered. "No time," Miller said, his face grim. He drew his service weapon. Ramirez nodded, bracing himself, then kicked hard. Just beside the bolt, the old wood splintered, groaned, and then burst inward with a deafening crack. They plunged into the Stygian gloom, flashlights cutting through the darkness, Cooper darting in ahead of them. The scene that confronted them was a tableau of pure horror. Victor Beaumont, his face a grotesque mask of sweat-sheened rage, had Grace by the arm, dragging her small, limp form across the filthy concrete floor. He still held the knotted rope, raised as if to strike. The child was drenched, shivering violently, her eyes squeezed shut, a tiny, whimpering sound escaping her blue lips. A large, overturned bucket lay nearby, icy water pooling around it. Cooper, bleeding from a gash on his flank, stood defiantly between Victor and the officers, his body low to the ground, a continuous, menacing growl vibrating in his chest, his eyes fixed on Victor, ready to intercept any further move towards Grace. "Freeze, police." Officer Miller's voice boomed, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the chaos. "Drop the rope. Hands in the air." Now, Victor froze, the rope still raised, his head snapping towards the officers, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and animalistic fury. For a split second, His arrogant belief in his own untouchability warred with the undeniable reality of 2 armed police officers and a snarling dog. The power, the control, the carefully constructed facade of Victor Beaumont shattered in an instant. His arrogance deflated, replaced by a sullen, trapped animal look. Victor slowly lowered the rope. Cooper, sensing the shift in dynamics, ceased his aggressive growling but remained tense. A low whimper of concern now directed towards Grace, his gaze never leaving her. Officer Ramirez moved quickly to secure Victor, his movements swift and professional, while Officer Miller knelt beside Grace. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice surprisingly soft. "You're safe now. We're here to help." Grace's eyes fluttered open, wide and dazed, staring up at the uniformed officer as if he were an apparition. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. She was carried out of that hellish basement, a small, broken bundle wrapped in a police officer's jacket. Cooper, despite his injuries, limped faithfully beside the officer carrying her, nudging her dangling hand with his wet nose, refusing to be left behind. His low, anxious whines were a constant, mournful prayer. Sarah Beaumont arrived at the hospital later, summoned from her fundraising luncheon by a terse, devastating phone call. The world she knew, the life she believed in, the man she had trusted, imploded in a maelstrom of unimaginable horror and dawning, sickening truth. She saw Grace, pale and still, hooked up to monitors, and a part of her died. From her window across the street, Mrs. Peterson watched the flashing lights, the grim-faced officers, the small form being carried out. A profound wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by an aching sorrow for the little girl who had endured so much. She had done the right thing. The dark chapter of Grace's life in the Beaumont mansion had slammed shut with the arrival of the police. Victor was in custody. Grace and Cooper were, for the moment, safe, but the echoes of the basement, the shadows of trauma, would linger long after the physical wounds began to heal. The future was an unwritten page, holding the possibility of healing, but also the certainty of a long, arduous journey out of the darkness. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the opulent facade of the Beaumont mansion in harsh, alternating strokes of red and blue, stripping away its veneer of respectability to expose the rotten core within. Victor Beaumont, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, was handcuffed and read out his rights, the cold metal cuffs a stark symbol of his precipitous fall from power. His protests, his indignant claims of misunderstanding, were met with the stony silence of officers who had witnessed the scene in the basement. The terrified child, the brave, battered dog, the instruments of his cruelty. He was booked on multiple felony charges of aggravated child abuse, false imprisonment, and animal cruelty. The investigation into the House of Horrors on Willow Creek Lane began immediately. Swift and thorough, the basement itself was a damning testament, and Cooper's emaciated, injured state spoke volumes. Sarah Beaumont was located at the tail end of the charity luncheon, a world away from the nightmare unfolding in her own home. The call came from a police detective, his words clipped, professional, yet devastating. She remembered little of the drive to the hospital, her mind a chaotic whirl of denial and a sickening, encroaching dread. When she arrived, a compassionate but firm social worker and a grim-faced detective gently, painstakingly, laid out the horrific truth of what Victor had been systematically inflicting upon Grace in her absence. The world Sarah knew, the meticulously constructed reality she had inhabited, didn't just crack, it exploded, leaving her adrift in a sea of unimaginable pain. Victor, her charming, successful, attentive husband, a monster. Grace, her sweet, suffering child, subjected to tortures she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The weight of it crushed her. Sobs racked her body, a primal outpouring of grief, guilt, and a rage so profound it left her breathless. How could she have been so blind? How could she have allowed this, believed his lies, dismissed Grace's fragmented, terrified pleas as mere fantasy? The guilt was a corrosive acid, eating away at her. For days, she existed in a fog of shock and self-recrimination. But beneath the layers of pain, a flicker of the fierce, protective love she bore for Grace began to reassert itself. The naive, trusting Sarah began to recede, replaced by a woman staring into the abyss of her own catastrophic misjudgment. A woman slowly, agonizingly, finding a new, steely resolve. Victor's true, monstrous nature was now undeniable, and her path forward, though terrifying, was clear. Grace was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit in critical condition. Severe hypothermia, advanced malnutrition, developing pneumonia, and a psychological trauma so deep it was a visible shroud upon her small, still face. The litany of her injuries was heartbreaking. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, their hushed, urgent movements a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the machines monitoring Grace's fragile hold on life. Cooper, meanwhile, had been taken to the local county animal shelter. Standard procedure in such cases. His wounds were cleaned and stitched by a shelter veterinarian who marveled at the dog's gentle demeanor despite his evident pain and starvation. But Cooper wasn't just any stray. Mrs. Peterson, in her detailed statement to the police, had emphasized the dog's role in alerting her. The officers on scene had vividly described Cooper's bravery, how he had led them to the basement, how he had stood guard over Grace even as Victor was being apprehended. And then, when Grace finally regained consciousness after days in a fragile state, her first coherent, whispered words were a desperate, tearful plea. "Cooper, where's Cooper? I need Cooper?" A child psychologist, assigned to Grace's case, recognized the profound, almost symbiotic bond between the child and the dog. This wasn't just a pet. This was a lifeline, a co-survivor, a key to Grace's potential recovery. After consultations between social services, the hospital, and a sympathetic shelter director, an unprecedented decision was made. Sarah, in the sterile, hushed environment of the hospital, spent every waking moment by Grace's bedside, her hand clutching her daughter's small, cool one. The days bled into nights. The initial shock gave way to a soul-crushing sorrow, then a burning, righteous anger, and finally, a profound, unwavering determination. She filed for an emergency restraining order against Victor, followed immediately by divorce papers, the Beaumont fortune, the opulent lifestyle. It all meant nothing. Her only focus was Grace. She began attending counseling sessions, not just for herself, to process the immense trauma and guilt, but to learn how to be the mother Grace would need to navigate the long, dark road ahead. The naive woman Victor had so easily manipulated was gone, forged in the fires of this horror into a warrior. A week after Grace regained consciousness, the hospital staff, in coordination with her therapist, arranged for Cooper's first visit. He was brought in by a gentle animal control officer, his tail giving a tentative, hopeful thump the moment he saw Grace, a small, pale figure propped up in the hospital bed. His weakness seemed to vanish. A joyful, whimpering yelp escaped him, and he strained against the leash. When he was allowed to approach, he moved with a tender caution, laying his head gently on the edge of her bed. Grace's eyes, still shadowed with pain, but now holding a fragile light, filled with tears. "Cooper." Her voice was a weak, reedy whisper, but filled with an incandescent love. "Oh, Cooper, it is you. I knew I knew you wouldn't ever hurt me." Her thin arms reached out, her fingers tangling in his soft, clean fur. He licked her hands, her face, his entire body quivering with a joy that mirrored her own. Nurses and even the stoic detective who had come to check on her progress found themselves blinking back tears. It was a reunion of pure, unadulterated love, a testament to a bond forged in terror and cemented in shared salvation. The legal proceedings against Victor Beaumont were swift. The evidence was overwhelming the state of the basement. Grace's medical reports, Cooper's condition, Mrs. Peterson's testimony, and eventually, Grace's own carefully elicited, heartbreaking account. Victor's attempts to portray himself as a misunderstood, well-meaning stepfather implementing unconventional therapies crumbled under the weight of his documented cruelty. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his name forever synonymous with monstrous abuse. The court formally terminated all his parental rights to Grace, a legal severing that Sarah welcomed with a grim sense of justice. Full custody was granted to Sarah, and, in a move that brought a fresh wave of healing tears to both Grace and Sarah, Cooper was officially released from the county's care and legally adopted by Sarah. He was no longer a piece of evidence, but a cherished, indispensable member of their small, broken, but rebuilding family. Life in the cavernous Beaumont mansion was unthinkable. As soon as Grace was stable enough to leave the hospital, Sarah, with the help of a few trusted friends and the ever-supportive Mrs. Peterson, found a new place to live. It was a small, rented bungalow on the other side of town, a world away from the cold opulence and shadowed corridors of their past. It was modest, with a cheerful yellow door, a small, sun-dappled yard, and large windows that let in the light. There were no locked basements, no hushed, fearful footsteps, no icy pronouncements of therapy. There was only peace, the gentle murmur of Sarah's voice, and the constant, comforting presence of Cooper. Grace's recovery was slow, a painstaking journey of both physical and psychological healing. Nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, less terrifying, often soothed by the warm weight of Cooper pressed against her bed. His soft snores, a lullaby of safety. She began physical therapy, real therapy this time, with kind, patient professionals who celebrated every tiny milestone. Cooper was her shadow, her furry crutch, her silent, steadfast cheerleader. He seemed to understand, with an almost human intuition, when she needed a gentle nudge of encouragement, or simply the quiet comfort of his head in her lap. A few years passed. The scars, both visible and invisible, began to fade. Though they would never entirely disappear, they became a part of Grace's story, a testament to her resilience. One bright spring afternoon, in the small, sun-drenched garden of their yellow-doored bungalow, Grace, now a girl of 10, laughed. It was a genuine, uninhibited laugh, clear and bright as a wind chime. She was sitting on a blanket spread on the grass, a book open in her lap, though her attention was currently on Cooper, who was enthusiastically, if somewhat clumsily, chasing a painted lady butterfly that flitted among Sarah's rose bushes. Grace still used her wheelchair for longer distances, but here, in the safety of her garden, she sometimes practiced walking a few tentative steps with custom-made braces, Sarah on one side, Cooper trotting patiently on the other, his tail wagging a steady rhythm of encouragement. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet confidence, a sparkle of nascent joy. Sarah watched them from the porch swing, a soft smile on her face. The lines of sorrow around her own eyes had softened, though they would always carry the memory of what had been. But now, they also held a profound peace and an overwhelming love for the two souls who were her world. Grace looked up at her mother, her face alight. "Mommy," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Cooper's my bestest, most wonderful friend in the whole wide world. He saved my life, didn't he?" Sarah's smile widened, tears welling, but these were tears of gratitude, of love. "He sure did. My love," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Cooper truly is our guardian angel, sent just for us." Cooper, as if understanding, abandoned his butterfly chase and trotted over to Grace, nudging her hand before settling beside her, his golden head resting contentedly in her lap, a furry embodiment of loyalty, courage, and the enduring, healing power of love. And under the brilliant golden sunshine of that peaceful afternoon, with Cooper's soft fur beneath her fingers and her mother's loving gaze upon them, Grace knew. She knew that even though the darkness had once been overwhelming, and the scars, both seen and unseen, might never completely fade, the unwavering warmth from her brave canine friend and the boundless love of her mother would forever be the twin flames warming her heart. They were her steadfast lighthouses, guiding her, step by hopeful step, into a new chapter of her life. A chapter filled with the promise of laughter, the strength of trust, and the enduring light of hope.